we do that through, when we do that through a synthetic process, it takes a lot of energy. It's pretty amazing that, you know, this gas that's floating in the air, which is N with this triple bond. So if you remember from way back in your chemistry days, it's N, 1, 2, 3 lines N. That is really, really difficult to break. And it takes a ton of energy to do it, which is why when energy prices go up, the cost of nitrogen fertilizer follows it. Because in order to make synthetic forms of nitrogen, they pull N2 gas out of the air, which seems like it would be pretty cheap. It's all just there. But then the cost of breaking the triple bond and then converting it into forms that then can be utilized by plants and for other processes is quite expensive. Okay, so there's lots of gas out there, but just that process to convert it is really expensive because it takes a ton of energy. So the Haber-Bosch process is the process that's used to basically break that triple bond synthetically. So the human sort of version of making plant available nitrogen. And like I said, it takes a lot of energy, natural gas, water, so it's expensive. And as input costs go up, energy goes up, etc. So doesn't the price of fertilizer. Okay. Oh, there we go. Microorganisms. Yeah, this is what's just, when you think about this, it's just amazing that it takes huge factories, huge, infrastructure to produce fertilizer. But these microscopic, baby, tiny, minuscule little microbes can do this all on their own. I'm just, oh, it's amazing, right? And those microbes are the same microbes for us in agriculture that are, have a relationship with legumes. So the bacteria that form relationships with alfalfa or clover, as an example, are the microbes that can pull N2 gas out of the soil air and convert it. They can break that triple bond and convert that nitrogen into a plant available form. And that really, before, the Green Revolution, that's how we got nitrogen to grow things, to grow crops. There was this interesting thing on NPR, 10 nutrient management classes ago, when I was driving probably to Rutland, where this was a topic. They were talking about where the protein that you eat today comes from versus where it came from in the 1930s. And they were just basically saying, for most people, 98% of all the protein you eat comes through this synthetic process, one way or the other, where pre-1930, it all came from this biological process with legumes. So there are other legumes besides, and other bacteria, not that many, besides the ones on clover, as an example, or soybeans, that also make that conversion, and like some cyanobacteria, etc. But it's really, I feel fortunate that in agriculture, we have the power to actually make our own nitrogen. And I can't say that about any other nutrient that we use. All right, so this is the nitrogen cycle, and it's pretty complex. We're going to go through it. And the reason I like to go through it is because it is complicated, and you have to understand how nitrogen moves around to better be able to manage it. And, this is really different. We didn't get into the phosphorus cycle so much. We might revisit it. But if you look at the phosphorus cycle, has like one loop, and this one has like 50. So it's much more complicated again. So as I mentioned, the atmospheric nitrogen up in the air can make its way down, onto our farms, basically from, purchasing fertilizer that takes the air, or takes the N2 gas out of the air and converts it into fertilizers. It can make its way down into the, ground into agriculture through lightning, which we joke about, but in certain parts of the country, they actually do take credit for nitrogen fixation through lightning, 30 pounds or something. We don't do that, but some people do. And then, of course, you have the bacteria in your soil, the ones that are attached to legumes that also can bring nitrogen into the system out of the air. And then we have crops that are growing, plants that are growing, animals that you're feeding, and the manure, right, that comes out the back end that essentially adds nitrogen into our system. So they're cycling it essentially. So you can have fertilizers, and then you can have organic matter nitrogen. So this RNH2, R stands for carbon in the chemistry world. I have no idea. Does anybody know why? Just put C. But I think because maybe it's complicated. But R stands for carbon. And this basically says that there's nitrogen stuck to carbon. And in that form, in the form of organic matter, you are adding nitrogen to the soil. Now, what forms can your plants take up? So you can see here plant consumption. Plants take up nitrates, and to a much lesser extent, they can also utilize ammonium. But mostly they like to take up nitrate, NO3 minus, right? So you can see in order to get any of this to that, there's a process. It's not just there. And that process is driven by the environment and biology. So the environment has to be just right, and the biology has to be actively working to be able to convert all your cow manure, most of it, and fertilizers to a form that your plants can use. So when some people say to me like, oh, why do I need those bugs in the ground? Well, even if you are not concerned about organic matter, or, you hear the word organic and you just cringe about it for whatever reason, you need biology in your soil to efficiently get nitrogen for your crops. Otherwise, your system is super inefficient. There'll be a lot of losses. You're going to add a lot more and get a lot less. Okay. So when you add fertilizer and some of the nitrogen in your manure, depending on what kind of manure you have, is in the form of ammonium, right? So in particular, fertilizers like urea, ammonium sulfate, okay? They will make their way still through a conversion, right? It does still take biology into ammonium directly that your plants can use. Cow manure, compost, plant residues, plow down legumes, plow down sods. That has to go through a biological process to make its way to ammonium, and then through another biological process to make its way to be nitrates for your plants to consume. So all of this is happening. You can't really see any of it. All that you actually see visually is either the crops are green or the crops are yellow, right? And when you see them yellow, like in the spring, maybe if you grow corn, you always go, they need nitrogen, right? So you visually see when the system isn't working so well, something's gone wrong, but you don't see all the process below the ground. So then you can see losses. Where can nitrogen be lost to? So there's runoff off the surface, right? So just through rainfall and water movement across the top of the ground. There's leaching, okay? And that goes usually more downwards into groundwater, possibly, not always. And then we have something called denitrification, which is the loss of nitrogen gas from the system. Now, these nitrogen gas, this one in particular, N2O, we hear a lot about, especially in the last few years. That is nitrous oxide, and that is the most potent greenhouse gas that we know of at this point. But it is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so we've heard a lot about it in our quest to reduce emissions in agriculture. Because in agriculture, because we are using nitrogen fertilizers and manures, there is a greater risk of nitrous oxide loss. So we want to manage that. We want to reduce that. Because any of these losses, okay, whether we believe they have an impact on the environment or not, they impact the bottom line of your farm, right? So if you're adding nitrogen and it's going somewhere else besides your crops, that is an economic loss for you. Okay, so regardless of how you feel about any of it, you want to retain whatever you're adding to the ground to grow really healthy crops at the lowest cost possible. Okay, so fertilizer's ridiculous. You don't want to put it on the ground and then watch it leach away when you just paid $700 a ton for it. So understanding this again is really important. All right. So nutrient cycling, as I already mentioned, and the cycling of nitrogen in particular, but other nutrients as well, is really dependent on biology and how active the biology is in your soil. And, you know, we might have more time to spend on this in later classes, but just to really recognize that those are living organisms too, right? And they're not just there. You have to actually take care of them, even though you may not necessarily have enough to worry about, you know, but taking care of the biology in the ground helps to cycle all of these nutrients and make them available to your crops. Okay, so ignoring them or not even realizing that they're there doing something important. I always used to make fun of my sister because the minute she'd see a ground beetle, it was like it was going to kill her or something, and she'd just brush out the sweat. What are you doing? Don't ever do that again in front of me. But, you know, because we don't always realize how important these little things are. And they are the ones making that nitrogen available at all these different levels. Okay. So ammonium and nitrate, again, is what the plants want to take up. It's actually the only things they can take up. There is a little bit of new literature showing that some plants might take up humic acids and things like that, but these are the primary forms of nitrogen. They don't like ammonium really, and if you have cattle or some kind of livestock, you know that ammonium can be toxic to your livestock also, and it's expensive for them to actually break down in their systems. So it's not the best source of nitrogen that we want in our animals either, like when we feed protein, right? If you look at a forage test, sometimes you see non-protein nitrogen, and usually that's a lot of ammonium, and you don't want that because it's expensive for the cows to actually have to utilize. Okay, well, it's the same for plants. So it takes more to actually break that down. It's expensive to them to be able to do it. So they'd rather take up nitrates. So mineralization is the first term we'll talk about, and that is the breakdown of organic nitrogen. So that's the nitrogen that's stuck on the manure, the old feed, the roots of the sod crop you plowed under, bedding, whatever it is you're putting out onto the ground, or maybe turning under the ground that really was once living, is considered an organic source of nutrients. Okay, so in Go Crop, we had this discussion today. When you see the term organic amendment, what that's actually talking about is something that was once living and you're using it as a fertilizer source. Okay? It doesn't mean it's certified organic or only for organic farms. It basically says it's something that was once living and now you're using it as a fertilizer. Okay, so manure and legumes are a good example of that. In order to break this off, you need soil microbes and you need all kinds. There's a whole process there, big ones, little ones, microbes, earthworms, all of those organisms play a role in taking this down and making the ammonium from the organic nitrogen. It's kind of a waste product for them. They will use some to grow because they're eating it because they need protein too, right? And then whatever's kind of left over becomes available to your plants. So we'll get into that later. All right, so in order for this to be efficient, active, you need a soil temperature above 50 degrees. So when it's cold out, nothing's really growing, including the microbes, right? They're in a sort of, I don't know if they put jackets on or hibernate. They probably hibernate. Burrows, I have no idea. They definitely are not wearing jackets. I don't think. I'll look into that. I'll report back to you. Right? I was picked anyway. Okay, so it's got to be warm. And that's why sometimes in the spring, especially if corn gets planted early, I use corn a lot as an example because it's really sensitive. It's kind of a wussy crop. It's sensitive to lack of nitrogen and a lot of other nutrients too. So, we are planting corn early and earlier and earlier. Acreage, there's more acreage often to plant. And so if it's cool and the corn comes out of the ground, always looks yellow. Oh my God, the corn looks so yellow. I should put on more fertilizer. Well, you probably put on plenty of manure and you just need to give the ground time to warm up so the microbes get working. They start eating the manure, right? Breaking it down and making the nitrogen available to your crops. So you need good temperature, but microbes also need air. So if you have compacted soil, you have less microbes, okay, less activity. It's also not good for your plants, right? It's harder for them to grow. Moisture, so they're less active when it gets too dry, which makes sense. We also will see nitrogen deficiencies when it's really wet and when it's really dry because microbes aren't working. And a nice home. So all of that together makes a nice home for them. All right. So what's immobilization? It's actually the opposite of mineralization. So if you've ever, if you have calves and hutches or horses or something and you use a lot of sawdust, okay, sawdust is pieces of wood. Wood has it's carbon, right? Not a lot of nitrogen in wood. And so when you use sawdust bedding and then you go out and let's just say you put it in your garden, right? Or you have this spot you spread it on in the field and everything looks really yellow after that and pretty stunted. And I've heard a lot of people say, oh, I spread that calf hutch manure out there and wow, I can't believe the corn looked horrible. Well, it's because the microbes that are in the soil that want to eat that carbon and break that down, they need a certain amount of nitrogen to do that. When you put manure on the field, there's a good amount of nitrogen in that. It's kind of like in the right proportions where they have enough nitrogen and enough carbon. So it's almost like a complete food source for them. They don't need to buy anything. They don't got to go out of the store and get a multivitamin or anything. But with sawdust or something that has a lot of carbon in it, like straw, that's another good example, there's not enough nitrogen there. There's not enough of everything else to get them to be able to break it down. So what they do is they start taking anything around them to do it. So they'll tie up nitrogen that would have been available to your crop to break that sawdust down. And so what that means for you as a farmer is it's not there for your crop yet. Okay. So that's immobilization. And generally over time, it works its way out. But if you put that sawdust bedded manure down and you go right, you till it in and go right out and plant into it, and the microbes start to try to break it down, chances are the crops are going to look pretty deficient because the microbes have taken more than nitrogen to try to do their job. Okay. All right. So then nitrification then converts the ammonium to nitrate. And that is interesting because with mineralization and immobilization, it's all kinds of microbes. But with nitrification, there's just two. Very specific, nitrous monas and nitrobacter, okay? And so without them, you don't get this. So again, it's really important to create an environment that is conducive for the microbes so that they're actually there to make this conversion. If they're not there, it doesn't happen. So when we talk about inhibitors, if you're putting nitrification inhibitors on your fertilizer, this is what generally they slow down. They slow down those bacteria, okay? They work in different ways. Different inhibitors do different things, but a nitrification inhibitor is slowing this process down, okay? So, you know, those have a wonderful role, especially in the climate we have right now, but that's essentially what they're doing. And that's how they're keeping nitrogen in this form for a longer period of time and having it more slowly released to your crops. And the same thing here, these microbes need certain conditions to thrive. And we talked about this last week about the pH. You need the pH up closer to 7 for these microbes to really get going. All right, so denitrification, like I said, is taking ammonium and soil bacteria, converting it to nitrous gas. So back into the N2, back out into the atmosphere, or N2O, which is nitrous oxide. So N2 gas, clearly that's a natural process, right? But N2O, we don't want too much of that. And any of this means that you've lost it, you know, out of the soil into the air, regardless. This happens when there's no oxygen, okay? So if you have heavy clay soil and it's completely saturated for a period of time, sometimes you see that corn turn yellow and people say, oh, I've lost all my nitrogen to leaching. No, like clay soils don't generally leach much unless they're tiled or, you know, really, really good structure. Generally, what's happening in those heavy saturated soils is you're losing the nitrogen to nitrous oxide. You're not losing it down through, you know, the soil profile. It's going up into the air. So again, it's really important to make sure that you have plenty of air in your soil. And when I say that, you know, it's really about minimizing compaction. I mean, we know what it does to our crops when you see a really compacted area on the farm. You know, the corn's like this, maybe a little bit taller than me. All the other corn's much taller. The grass, you go out and with your manure spreaders and you can see the tracks. If it was wet, you see the tracks where the manure spreader went because grass isn't growing. It's yellow, right? So it's become compacted and it's yellow because these processes can't work, right? So minimizing compaction, which I know is really difficult, is super important to functioning of pretty much everything in the ground because we need air. All right, so volatilization is when we lose ammonium from the surface of the ground into the air, and we call that volatilization, and it moves into the air in the NH3 form, so the ammonia gas form. And so any ammonium fertilizers that you apply to the surface of the ground, so if you're applying manure to hay ground, as an example, there's lots of ammonium in manure, or you're putting on urea-based fertilizers, you know, when you top dress your corn, or you top dress your hay fields, that is all at significant risk to loss through volatilization. That's your, besides surface runoff, that's the primary way you're going to lose nitrogen when you surface apply it. And, you know, there are certainly conditions that lead to more volatilization than other conditions. So one of the things we definitely highly recommend if you're using urea-based fertilizers is to use what we call a urease inhibitor on the fertilizer, which is different than a nitrification inhibitor, okay? But what that does is it nearly eliminates volatilization. Now, you can use other forms of fertilizer like ammonium sulfate that volatilizes less. But if you're using any kind of urea-based fertilizers and it's hot, it's windy, and the ground is moist, you'll probably lose about 90% of whatever you just put on the ground within days. So, you know, especially as we move into summer, not if it's hot and dry, because you got to have water to basically break the urea down. When you have the water and the wind and the heat, you know, it's like being in a shower. It's just the steam, right? It's just rolling off and it's taking with it your nitrogen fertilizer. So again, using some kind of urease inhibitor in today's, you know, weather, I think is really smart. And I will also add, if you are involved with NRCS programming, they pay for nitrogen inhibitors. So people should sign up if you're enrolling in any kind of NRCS programs. And it was $26 an acre. Now I heard it's $34. So it's actually definitely covers the cost of the inhibitor. Now, on your hay fields, I mean, you're gonna lose a lot of it. So we also have been looking at inhibitors for manure, urease inhibitors for manure. And if anybody's interested in that, we can talk more about it, but we're running out of time. So just keep going. All right, so again, soil, livestock. I've talked about this a bunch, so I won't keep getting into it. Just, we've got to take care of what's down below the ground living to be able to maximize nutrient cycling, amongst other things. You know, we talked last week, although I heard I sounded like a tin can here, so maybe you just heard, is that what you said, Jennifer? Sounded like I was coming to a tin can, something like that. But, you know, the soil biology is what keeps the soil permeable, especially on clay soils, loamy soils. You know, sands always drain, right? Because the particle size is really big. They're like a lot of little pebbles and a lot of space. But when you have any kind of clay in your soil, you have really small particles, and you have to be able to figure out how to create that airspace. And it's really the microbes and the growth of plants and roots that makes airspace, okay, for the crops to grow, for water to drain, and to create homes, right, for all the other things to habitate, live. There we go. Down below the ground. So here's just a great slide of what we're trying to do down below through biological activity, is to create enough airspace, right, in between the soil for the microbes to live, for water to drain, for roots to grow, okay? It doesn't just happen. You actually have to kind of work at making it happen. And if you farm clay soils and you plow them often and you don't rotate your crops, you probably find them very, very difficult to manage, right? They seal up, they crust over, all those things are because they don't have this kind of structure to them. So we have to create that through crop rotations, the type of crops we grow, and feeding the biology. right? And that's also how we're going to get nitrogen to cycle around in our soils and not be lost. Okay. I didn't know I was going to talk about this, but here I am. Okay. So again, we're trying to create a soil environment that has a lot of pore space. That's what we call it. So that's for water and air to be able to move down through the soil. And also in these little spaces, right? That's where the microbes hang out and they're protected. Maybe protected from their enemies, maybe protected from when it gets too dry or too wet, right? Too hot, too cold, all those things. If you compare it to the picture on the left, you can see this soil has no structure. Where do the microbes live, right? How does this plant root manage to get down through that and expand and explore all of the soil? How does it even get out of the ground? You can see, and we've all seen this, the crusting over the top of our soil after a really heavy rainfall, or maybe not even a heavy one. Okay, so what we're trying to create is a soil that has all of these little aggregates, okay, and that are strong. So when it rains, they stay there, right? So if they're strong, they won't bust when they get hit with a raindrop, which can hurt. I mean, I've been hurt by a raindrop before. I consider myself fairly tough, but you've been outside now, like heavy rainstorm, you're like, right? So you can imagine how this like a little soil particle feels if it can hit your arm and you're like, right? So when the water raindrop hits the ground here, we want it to go down. We don't want it to go across, right? So as we're talking about the environment and we're talking about runoff, we're talking about soil loss, this is what we have to achieve to minimize losses into the environment, right? To maximize the growth and productivity of our plants, etc. So how do we achieve this? Well, a big part of achieving that is through the biology. They make those little nuggets, okay? Because they're dirty, gooey, and gross, right? So if you're a 10-year-old like my son, you'd be like, oh, that's so cool, so gross. And so it's the microbes and the plant roots and the worms, right? And all the organisms that are living down below, working every day, that are making glues. You know, they have byproducts too. They're sticky. And they start gluing together. They take those soil particles and other pieces of organic matter, little plant roots, whatever's there, or dead bugs, etc. And it makes this little soil aggregate. All different kinds, all different sizes. That's what you want. And the more sort of biologically active your soil is, not just with microbes, right? Like the types of plants you have, having roots growing all the time, all of those things, these become more diverse, but they also become stronger. The stronger the glue, the better, right? And a surefire way to bust those suckers up is through really intensive tillage, right? So not that I'm not opposed to tillage, but I'm in favor of thoughtful tillage, understanding that every time you make a pass through that field, you are busting those up, and it takes time for the microbes. First, they're going to be mad at you, and then they're going to be, okay, I guess we'll start over again, and they'll try to keep going, and then you, lo and behold, you're back out there, chop, chop. So, you know, thoughtfulness around maintaining these and how we go about that is really critical, because if you get a 7-inch rainstorm, you're just like, for most people, these things are blowing apart. And then the next thing you know, you've just got cement out there. Now, if you have really, really well aggregated soil, you go back out there, it doesn't look like that. It looks like little particles on the soil, and you can hear the water going down. Okay, so this is really, really important. Okay, so same thing with infiltration, runoff. Having those aggregates is how we get the water to go down, not across. It's like, I probably showed this on my second nutrient management class ever, because I think this was from like 2007, which now is many, many years ago. But it's just the perfect example of what I'm talking about. This was after a 7-inch rainstorm in Addison County, 2 different farms. This is the one I got called out to because their corn was gone after that storm and they didn't know what to do. And it was pretty late, you know, the corn was out of the ground, maybe about this much. A lot of it was buried underneath the clay. Some of it was still living. I mean, clearly it was probably gonna have to be replanted if you wanted to have anything. I want to say it was in June, right? So it was already it was kind of late. And then thinking about, how long is that going to take to dry out? You know, it could be a couple of weeks before we could get it. It's got to all be reworked up. By the time that happens, I don't know, it might be close to the 4th of July, you know, plus it already planted, already paid all that money. Now we got to buy more corn seed, etc. Now, interestingly, this field was at another farm that I stopped at just to say hi on my way back home. And this field had just come out of, it was just rotated out of sod. And you can see what I'm talking about, right? You can see those little aggregates on the top of the soil. The rain did not bust those apart at all. And this field was fine. And when I say you can hear the water, that's why I said that, because I could hear the water. Have you ever heard the water like moving down through the ground? I could hear it like kind of bubbling through. And I could see like air, like little air bubbles and stuff on the, like coming out of the top of the soil. It was going to be fine. But this was not. This is expensive. When people tell me I don't have time to think about that, I don't have time to do that. I don't have time to do this. Well, that's expensive. And it happens more and more and more and more and more and more now than it ever used to. It's not uncommon. At the time, that was pretty uncommon to get that kind of storm. That's not uncommon anymore. So this is the kind of soil environment we really, really are trying to get people to be thinking about and understand how important that is to the success of your farm at this point, because of the kind of weather we're having. Okay, so we already talked about nitrogen losses into the air, into the surface water, into the groundwater. Now, if you remember last week when we talked about the cation exchange capacity and the soil having negative charge, right? So the reason we lose nitrates to leaching is because they have a negative charge. And I think maybe it was 2nd grade, you got the magnets out and, right, you're trying to push the magnets together and oh no, that doesn't work, right? So opposites attract. And so your soil is attracted to positively charged nutrients, but it pushes away negatively charged nutrients. So that's why, you know, we get concerned about losing nitrates to the groundwater. And sometimes once ammonium's in the soil, we try to keep it in that form and convert more slowly, because this holds on to the soil, right? So it's a little bit, once it's in the ground, it's less prone to loss. When ammonium's on the surface of the ground, it's more prone to loss because it'll volatilize. Okay. All right. Here comes the fire hose again. Okay. So let's talk about microbes and plant microbial relationships. We've talked about this a few times over the last few weeks. And we always hear legumes make nitrogen. They don't make nitrogen. Bacteria make nitrogen. And they have a symbiotic relationship with legumes. So without the bacteria, alfalfa does not make its own nitrogen, right? Without the bacteria, soybeans don't make their own nitrogen. They rely on a bacteria that lives in this little nodule to do that work for them. So again, the bacteria, mostly rhizobium, actually in soybeans, it's a whole different bacteria, but nonetheless, it's a bacteria. If did you see that? Is that because I'm close to it? Made like a little thing. I don't know. Yeah. So the bacteria have to form a relationship with the legume. And in return, the legume gives the bacteria carbon. Okay, so it's not for free. So when you start, and I'm sure people have heard this before, don't spread manure on your alfalfa. Why? Well, there's a bunch of reasons, but the primary one is because if you give alfalfa the nitrogen it needs more easily than what it can get it for from the bacteria, then it gets rid of the bacteria, right? You've heard, oh, it'll get lazy. Maybe you haven't heard that, but that's what we say in the biz. It'll get lazy. Because it doesn't want to give up anything if it doesn't have to, right? So if you're growing legumes, you have to really be mindful, and you want them there. Then you have to be a little bit mindful about how you fertilize them so they, are doing the job that we want them to, okay? So again, it's symbiotic. It takes, once you plant the crop, it usually takes about a month for the bacteria to sort of get on there and grow and start making nitrogen, etc. So with soybeans, some people find a benefit to giving the soybeans a little tiny bit of nitrogen starter because it'll take some time before the soybean forms that association and starts getting nitrogen. Let's see. And again, with rhizobium, with the bacteria, they need in a certain environment. They like certain nutrients. They have high affinity for things like manganese and molybdenum, things we don't think about a lot. And I feel like it's one of the only molybdenum deficiencies I've actually ever seen has been in soybeans down in Addison County in Addison, actually. Okay, and that's about it there. Was I gonna say something else? I don't know. I don't think so. Oh, inoculants. So, if you're growing clover or planting clover, usually most soils, there's been enough clover grown around here that, people can go without inoculating. I definitely recommend always inoculating. So sometimes you have to buy it. It's that black powdery stuff. A lot of seed nowadays comes coated already with it. So you just have to check the label. But it's good to it's cheap. It doesn't cost much to get the inoculant. With soybeans, definitely inoculate. But, the legumes usually you can get away without doing it, if you forgot. I've had people call, oh, I forgot to put the inoculant on. What am I going to do? So usually it's fine, but it will go faster, right? The bacteria will be right there when the plant starts growing. Okay. Now I have this funny joke, but in my training through the university, I guess it's not appropriate anymore. So I cannot. You can use your imagination about what's going on there, but sorry, I've been given the inappropriate talk. So I've given inappropriate talks, but I've also been given that is inappropriate to be talking about talk. So we can talk about this on the side with people that are interested in my joke here. That was really funny 10 years ago, but now I guess not funny anymore. Anyway, okay, there are other relationships below ground especially between grasses and legumes. So there definitely is usually a lot of benefit to having mixed stands out there. And we talked about this, I think, on the first class, having mixed stands, especially with grass, with legumes, helps to reduce some of the nitrogen need of the grasses. And there's also, strong evidence that grasses are more efficient at building other relationships with mycorrhizae, which are a different kind of microorganism. They're a fungus that sort of coats and lives on the plant roots and helps expand the surface area of the plant roots, allowing them to access more nutrients. Okay, I do get asked quite often, should I put mycorrhizae on my whatever? And I don't have a good answer for you. But I will say, in a lot of our systems, if you're fertilizing them heavily and there's already plenty of nutrients, usually adding something like that isn't going to really benefit you, because the reason those things are there is so they can help each other. And again, so if a crop has plenty of free nitrogen in the soil already, it's probably not going to waste its energy having a relationship with mycorrhizae. Okay, so let's get into on-farm nitrogen sources. So these are what we would call an organic amendment. These are things that we have generally on many of our farms. Not all, obviously. If you don't have livestock, most farmers that take this class are livestock operations, but some row crops as well, you may not have manure or legumes. So what are sources of on-farm nitrogen? So manure, obviously, and manure sources differ. So if you have dairy versus beef versus hogs, the amount of nitrogen in those different types of manure is going to differ. And whether or not you apply it on the surface or you incorporate it will also make a difference in how much of that nitrogen becomes available to your crop. So for all the things that we've talked about already, some I'm sure you've already forgotten, when you surface apply nitrogen, you get less of it for your crop. Because, one, remember I said, when you have nitrogen applied on the surface of the ground, there is a higher risk of losing it to the air. Okay, so that's one reason. And the second reason is because when the manure is on the surface of the ground, a lot of that nitrogen is attached to carbon and microbes have to break it down. So if it's on the surface of the ground, it's going to take longer for that to happen because it's not in direct contact with all the microbes. So when manure is incorporated, you should get more nitrogen out of it faster. Okay. All right. So there's different kinds of nitrogen in your manure, and I've already alluded to this. There's urea N, so what comes from urine. Okay. This is ammonium N. So on your manure test, it would actually be called NH4-N. So this is readily available. It's equivalent to really urea fertilizer. So that part of your manure should be readily available to your crops, just like if you're adding urea, unless it gets lost through all the different ways we said it could get lost, right? Okay, organic nitrogen is the other fraction of nitrogen in your manure. That is not so quickly available, right? Because that has to be mineralized. The microbes have to get all over that and start chomping it and eating it and breaking it down. And that takes time, okay? Some of it can be broken down really quickly, remember? So let's say green grass versus straw. Green grass is going to break down quickly. Straw is going to break down more slowly because of the things I was talking about, right? Like they need so much to be able to break it down. So in manure, If you have solid manure that you're putting on the ground and it's a lot of bedding, a lot of straw, right? It breaks down slower than liquid manure that usually has a lot finer particles. A lot of people are bedding with sand at this point, things like that. So the type of manure that you have will influence how much organic N you have versus how much ammonium N, and how it's stored as well, right? Okay, so you add these two together, and that's the total amount of nitrogen you have available from your manure. So if you have your manure test, you can follow along on there. Okay, so here is book value. Okay, so in this nutrient recommendations for field crops in Vermont, there are book values for manure. So what does that mean? Well, there are values in a book, but they also actually came from, the average of manure nutrient content from samples that have been submitted to the lab. Okay, so it's basically all the liquid manure with this, level of dry matter, average all that together, and what does it look like? So this is dairy liquid manure, 7% dry matter. The total amount of nitrogen you have in every 1,000 gallons is 25 pounds. That's a lot, right? 4,000 gallons and get 100 pounds of manure or 100 pounds of nitrogen. Woo woo, right? Celebrate this time. Come on. Okay. But sorry, 12 pounds of that is ammonium nitrogen. That's the urea. I'm like, nobody said it. I think no, not doing that. There we go. Okay. 12 pounds is in the form of like urea, right? So that's readily available to your crop when you put it on the ground. And then 13 pounds is in the organic form. So some of that will be available. It'll get broken down pretty quick by the microbes, and some of it will take time. And we actually give it 3 years. So you get some this year when you apply it, and then you'll get some in the second year and some in the third year. So that part is like your bank account of nutrients. And over time, kind of, it adds up. You'll get 8 pounds of phosphorus and 20 pounds of potassium, which is a lot. There's a lot of potassium in especially liquid manure, okay? And 4 pounds of magnesium, 10 pounds of calcium. And if you look on your manure test, it also tells you about other micronutrients too. Okay. 7,000 gallons per acre. That's like a decent amount. 175 pounds of total nitrogen you're putting on. Okay, you'll get 84 pounds of ammonium nitrogen, right? That's like ready for your crop to use. 91 pounds of organic N. It's going to take some time. 56 pounds of phosphorus and 140 pounds of potassium. Look at your soil test. Your soil test says, let's say you're growing corn. Soil test says you need 120 pounds of nitrogen. So like, bingo, right? I've got that. 40 pounds of phosphorus and 120 pounds of potassium. So you're thinking, okay, I'm going to do this. This is what I'm doing. I'm meeting the nutrient needs of my crop. Okay. But as we already talked about, that ammonium N is subject to loss, especially if it's left on the surface of the soil. So if you can incorporate it, then you need to incorporate it as quickly as possible, because then you retain more of that nitrogen. The longer it sits on the surface, which clearly it does if you're no-till or you're hay, you're growing hay, there will be a substantial portion of that loss. Okay, so days after spreading, and then ammonium nitrogen loss. So you can see 2 weeks, if it's sitting on the ground, we haven't maybe gotten any rainfall, it's been drier, wet, whatever, windy, etc. If it's on the ground, you're losing basically all of it. 80% of that. So you had 12 pounds, but you've just lost almost all of it, okay? So if you can incorporate it, right, the faster you incorporate it, so if you're injecting manure as an example, you retain almost all of that for your crops. So immediate incorporation, you should still get about 95% of that. Now, of course, not that that can't be lost below ground in all the other ways we talked about, but if you can get it in the ground, you'll have less loss. So anything that reduces volatilization will minimize those losses. Yeah.
So presumably, like this manure would be sitting in a pit or it would be sitting field stacked,
Mhm.
type of manure. So how does that? I mean, there would be losses of nitrogen from those two sources.
There are, yeah, but not when it's on the surface of the ground. It has to come in contact with a urease enzyme. So that's really the, you know, difference. And then wind, water, you know, just the conditions.
So it's being preserved fairly well in a stack
Until you start agitating it, but yeah. Yep. All right, so here's so this is from spring or summer applied manure, not fall. So spring or summer applied. If you incorporate it immediately, you get almost all of the ammonium nitrogen. Okay, but the longer you wait, right, depending on the type of manure it is, the more loss potential. And these are, you know, it's based on research, but clearly if the conditions aren't right, you're not going to lose it, but you can't really plan on it that much. If you don't want to plan on the 84 pounds that we calculated, because chances are if you're putting it right on the surface, you're going to lose a good portion of that. Okay, so again, 7,000 gallons of manure, 84 pounds times 15%. So maybe I said I was going to incorporate it within 5 to 7 days. I basically am only going to get 12 pounds out of all of that, right? So when you start thinking about that, you think about what it costs to replace that with urea, which is what a lot of people do. They'll spread manure on their hay fields and then they go back out and they put on urea fertilizer and they get a better response. Well, it's because you just lost all the fertilizer value. And that's why I've been looking at these inhibitors in manure, because it's actually retaining that nitrogen. Okay. And then this is the organic portion, right? Remember I said it takes time for that to break down. So we had 91 pounds of that. Now, how quickly that breaks down depends on, again, if it's incorporated, if it's on the top of the ground, and the type of soil you have, you know, and like the drainage of it, and then also the dry matter of the manure. So here I just use this example saying that my soil was well to moderately well drained. It's surface applied, so I'm only going to get 24% of the organic nitrogen in year 1. So I'll get 21 pounds, 22 pounds of that organic N. And then you can see I'll get more next year and more the year after. So this is a little, the organic N is a little less prone to that like volatilization loss. Again, it's kind of your bank account. It's your slow release nitrogen, but you also don't get all of it in 1 year. You have to recognize that. So if you just looked at your manure test and you said, heck yeah, I got enough here, not putting on any more fertilizer, you'll probably be disappointed. But if you think about how to manage it, then you can get more and maybe meet the needs of your crops. All right, so again, here's what was in the manure we put on the ground. Here was the actual availability, okay? And that's still what I needed for my crop. So again, if you only looked at this, didn't know anything about the nitrogen cycle, you would probably be disappointed. Okay, but now that you know this, you can plan for it and know that you're going to need to add some more nitrogen somewhere or more manure possibly. All right, as far as legumes go, when you terminate a stand of legumes, we don't have that many stands of pure alfalfa around Vermont, but if you had one, okay, the better the stand, and usually people wait till there's no alfalfa there anymore. The better the stand of alfalfa, the more nitrogen you get when it is turned over to grow a different crop, okay? So if you have a really strong stand or even a fair stand of alfalfa and you terminate it to grow, let's say, corn, you should, in the first year, have plenty of nitrogen to grow a corn crop, okay? And same with manure. There is nutrients available in the first year from the alfalfa, which would be those, the little balls, right? The nodules, they die off. All that nitrogen gets released. It gets broke down really quickly. All the leaves. That's why I asked you how much growth, because there's a lot of nitrogen in alfalfa, right? So if you have some top growth, you plow that under, all that becomes available in the first year. But the roots and like a lot of the stems, that will become available in the next year. So you get multiple years of credit. Okay, red clover and soybean credits. So, well, this is sod and cover crops, but red clover, white clover, other types of legumes have slightly less nitrogen value. Soybean actually hardly has any. So the subsequent crop might get 25, 30 pounds. It's not a huge nitrogen fixer. When you plow down grass, okay, you do get nitrogen credit from that. Not because it makes nitrogen, but because in the leaves, right, in the body of the plant, there's protein. So when that decomposes, you get that back into the ground. So you can get about 70 pounds of nitrogen when you terminate a sod. And then cover crops, like winter rye, which is the most common one. In general, we usually see about 25 to 45 pounds of nitrogen from a terminated cover crop, a winter rye cover crop. If there's a good amount of biomass and it's green when it's terminated and there was manure likely applied to that field, okay? So there's a wide range of what we see embodied in the winter rye, but remember, grasses don't make nitrogen, right? They have nitrogen in their leaves and in their roots because they have to have nitrogen to grow, just like we do. So there's a level of protein. If you think about when you harvest feed, right? When you harvest the grass at the right stage, the protein levels are 18, 20%. That means there's a lot of nitrogen in there. If you terminate that same grass and put it under the ground, that protein becomes available to your next crop, okay? And then if you terminated that grass when it's headed out and it's only 10% nitrogen or 10% protein, okay? There's more there, but again, there's more carbon and less nitrogen. So it will release that, but it'll take longer. All right, so let's get into Go Crop again this week. So hopefully everybody got through their homework last week, which was building the fields. So putting in your field information, adding in some of the soil information. You learned how to upload soil tests. So now once you have all the fields in there, you'll be able to do that. And Sarah, I'm sure you're just totally good on that. I'm not, so here we go. So you want to go back into your farm that you've been working on. And this week, we're going to go back to fields. And you can see, I only have 2 fields. It's a pretty small farm, but the big field, you can see now has a crop in it. Okay, for most of you, maybe you charged ahead but most everybody hasn't entered crops yet. I haven't shown you how to do that, but some people figure it out and they just go through and do it. But I did this one when I got here just to show you. So we're gonna do this week. We're gonna put the crops in. Okay, so when you finish, you'll have whatever crop you're gonna be growing this coming year listed there. So how do you enter crops? Well, you want to go into your field and you can just hit edit. If you go to the ... you can also enter edit. You can edit from there as well. But the easiest thing to do is just go, I wanna edit. Okay. Oops, no, you don't. Oh, here we go. I want to go into my field. I'm going to go into this one. And then you can see there's all these options. So you guys filled out already information. So you can see there's now rotations you got to fill out. You got to fill out crops. You got to do the nutrient planning still. And then there's field records that obviously come this season as you're implementing your plan. So today, and for your homework, if you don't finish, we're going to fill out the rotation tab and we're going to fill out the crops tab. Okay. If you haven't uploaded the soil test yet, you can see it says field details, soils, the map, if you mapped out the field, and soil tests. Most of you should be able to upload those automatically if you just got your samples. If not, you'll have to go back in there and enter them for each field. All right, so I'm going to go to rotation. And there's a button for edit under planned rotation. So last week, you were to enter soil types, dominant soil types for the field, right? And then the T for that soil type. So there's the tolerable soil loss for each soil type. Hopefully you remember that. And so that's showing up here. It's saying for this field with whatever soil type it has, which is obviously a pretty good one, I can lose up to 5 tons of soil per acre per year. So now we're going to enter your predicted soil loss. So that comes off from the Russell 2 printout that we talked about the very, very first day. Okay. And if you remember, what you were supposed to do is look at those and make sure you were meeting T. Okay. And if you weren't, you're going to go back and work with your planner to come up with some solutions to meet T. So meeting T again means that across that field's rotation, you will be losing less soil than the tolerable soil loss, right? So across the whole, averaged across the whole rotation. But if you have, I want to call it an actual rotation, which means maybe you're growing corn for a few years and then you're growing grass, or maybe you're growing corn and soybeans and then grass, or you're growing pumpkins and then you're growing grass. So you're growing multiple crops over multiple years. You are going to need to add the soil loss for each year in the rotation. Okay, so let's go in here, hit edit. Okay, so here's my field, track and field number. So it says, what is the Russell 2 average soil loss? Okay, so that is going to come off from your Russell 2 printout. And it's hard to show people online, but there was an example in your book, but you also have, you should have your own. You can pull those out. They should be in the risk assessment section. They may be somewhere else. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna pull this one out. Here's the example from your book. It's on that, whatever color this is. Guess I can go to Zoom. Yeah. The bar might be able to.
Like I'm in school cheating. Pass me your notes under the table. Place for yes.
Sorry, everybody, I'm trying to figure out how to actually turn my camera on. Anyway. Okay, well, it looks like this. You guys should have your own, so you can pull those out.
Do it because I think because your screen share,
Okay.
maybe it won't let you
That's
do it.
fine. Okay, in the class, hopefully whoever's assisting you can show you your Russell 2 printout.
Oh, right in the front.
Yeah, there you go. I said it was in the back. Yours is in the front. My example was in the back.
Mine was in the
Okay, so if you have a rotation, there will be a number that says conservation plan soil loss tons per acre per year. Okay, following the rotation, it's one number. And that's the number that has to meet T. So in my example, T is 2, so my rotation average is 0.74. I'm gonna add that in. Now this is not T. Okay, you already put T in. This is your soil loss, predicted soil loss, okay, across the rotation. Now, if you're growing a continuous crop of something, for most people it'll be grass, okay, it's always grass, never anything else. You're just gonna have one number. Okay, that's what you put here under the rotation, and that's what you're gonna put in the years as well. Okay, so you put in across the rotation, and then it asks you to put in your crop. Probably should put in crop first. Anyway, whatever. Okay, so this is going to be a hay field. Actually, mine's going to be cornfield. I'm changing that. Go back. These should be in alphabetical order, but they're not. Here, so is it on the top? There we go. All right, I'm going with corn. Okay, and then it asks you for the years in that rotation soil loss. So my rotation on my printout is 8 years. So yes, you need to add in all 8 years of the rotation here and the soil loss value associated with each year. Again, if you're grass, you just have one value and you only have really 1 year. Okay. So if you're grass, you'll put your one value, which should be the same as the rotation one, and then check current year. Okay, that just tells us every year that's what you're growing. That's what's going to show up. If you have a 8-year rotation with different crops, you're going to add in each year of the rotation. So my first year of corn is this. Then I got to add another year of corn. And my next year gets more soil loss. Okay. I'm going to add another row. It's also corn, not canola, not that. Okay. Thought it would. Okay. And then I'm up to something else. All right. Now I'm going into hay. So I'm in the 4th year, I rotate into hay. And it's going to be new, right? And that year in the rotation, the soil loss is 2.6. And then I'm going to add another row because I'm going to be in hay for so many years, right? So then I'm hay established, and it's grass hay. There's no legume or not much. Okay. Put in that year, 3.8, and then add another row because I'm going to be in grass for 3 years. We're going to end it there so this doesn't take us all day. Okay, grass hay established. And 0.19. All right, so that's the rotation off my sheet with the yearly soil loss values. In some cases, some people are continuous corn silage, maybe with a cover crop, maybe without. Okay, So you'll just have, if you're continuous corn silage with a cover crop, select that, put in the one number you have, and check current year. Now, the mistake when you have these kind of rotations that I see most often is one, people forget to check what year they are at in the rotation, or they accidentally check the wrong one, right? So I accidentally checked that it was in grass, but I'm actually in my first year of corn. So you need to check whatever year you are at in the rotation. So I'm going to be in first year of corn. Okay, so then you're done here, and then you update. Okay. So again, if you're a continuous grass farm, or you have a lot of grass fields and they're permanent, you're only going to have one number, and it'll be the same one that you use as the rotation soil loss and the year soil loss. Okay. If you have something more complicated, you're going to have multiple years you got to enter. And then you need to check what year you are in the rotation, and you can see once you save it, it's highlighted, bolded. That's where you are in your rotation. Okay. So it says I can lose 5 tons. The average for the whole rotation is 0.74. So I meet the requirement, and then here's each year in the rotation. Each year, this is what goes into the P index. Okay. So when we start calculating chance for phosphorus loss, it uses whatever year in the rotation you're at. It doesn't use the average. That's why it has to be in there. Okay, so you need to do that for every field. This could be simple, could be complicated, depends on your farm. Okay, then you need to go to crops. And you say, well, that's annoying. I just put in 8-year rotation with all the crops, but it says I have no crops. Well, right, you got to add in what you're actually doing, and people sometimes like to add a little more detail here. They like to get more specific about what it is. Oftentimes on your rotation here, it might just say grass, but you want to say that it's, or it might just say legume, grass, hay, legume, and you want to pick something more specific. In this section, you can really define what you're doing. So you need to add the crop in. Sometimes you get off your rotation, just similar to getting off your rocker, I think, but maybe not the same. Okay, so you go into crops, you add a crop, adding a crop. And I said I was in the first year of corn. So I'm just going to pick that from my list. Oh, wait, type. So it's corn, it's an annual. The crop, growing corn silage, and then it says purposes. Probably not grazing the corn, but if this was a perennial forage, let's say some people harvest the field for hay and they graze it. So you'd want to check both. Okay. But in this case, just harvesting it. Right. And then it asks what the legume percentage is. You don't have to put anything for corn, but if you're growing a perennial grass, forage, hay, whatever, pasture, you do need to put something, even if it's 0, because your recommendation will change based on how much legume is in that field. Okay. So it's just an estimate. And when it really makes a difference, right, how much nitrogen the soil test is going to recommend is if you're 30% or more legume, which is quite a bit of legume. Okay. So if you don't really know, but you know it's not much, just put 10, 15, okay? So I'm not going to put anything. I don't have to. All right. Surface cover percentage. There are little notes here. They're meant for you to read because they're kind of like instructions, details. If you do not know this number, you can use 15 for low coverage crops, which would be corn, okay? Or like soybeans grown in 30-inch rows, and 80 for high coverage crops such as hay. So perennial forages, pastures, they will, you'll always want to say they're 80% or more covered. You don't look down at the ground and see a lot of bare ground. You shouldn't anyway, right? But if it's corn, it usually needs to be about 15. Okay? Only 15% of the ground's actually covered with a crop. So just, follow the instructions. And it does get used in the P index, okay? So it is important, you have to fill it out. Are there any other practices you're using here? I guess I'll put got a cover crop. There we go. All right, going down. Okay, and then it asks annual crop details. Does it overwinter? So this really relates to if, let's say you planted triticale in the fall and you're gonna harvest it as feed the next year, something like that. I'm gonna say no. Harvest details, more than one harvest, no. And then it asks you for your anticipated yields. Okay, so these are going back to realistic yields. I'm gonna say 20. And then it asks for your units, tons per acre. All right, so there's that. Doo-doo. Saving. There it is. Okay. And you're done. So you got to do that for each crop on, or each field on the farm. So rotation and crops. So I'm going to go back to my fields. And I'm going to go into the big field because I want to show you the hay example because it is different. Oops. And I already did this one. So we'll go into the ... All right. So if you're going to put in a perennial crop, okay, it's going to ask you if it's a seeding year, when it was established, if it's always been there, you know, just you can put in any year really. Cultural practices, all hayfields are no-till, so I always check no-till. Legume percentage, okay, so again, that has to go in if you're putting in a perennial forage. Surface coverage, 80%. So then it said, are you taking more than one harvest? Yes, I'm gonna harvest that hayfield a couple of times. And then it asks you what your anticipated yields are. Now, yields need to be in dry matter tons. Okay, so you may take 8 tons of wet feed off of there, but what is that on a dry matter basis? Okay, so I said I'm getting 3 tons per acre, but I also said that I graze this field. So then it will ask you some questions about, do you graze it more than once? And I said, yes, I hay it and then I graze it 4 times. And then it'll ask you, how much anticipated yield do you get per graze? Excuse me, I didn't do this on purpose, but I'm glad I screwed it up because people screw it up. So this is per graze. I said I'm going to get a ton every time I graze. Which you won't, like, you know, maybe. Usually it's a lot less than that. And so I said if I graze it 4 times, I'm getting 4 tons of feed off of there, plus the 3 tons I got from haying it, which is pretty slightly unrealistic for most situations, okay? So just make sure what you put here, when you see the total yield at the end of the season, it's not an unrealistic amount. Okay. Then down below, once you do that, it's going to give you recommendations if your soil test information has been added, okay? So you can see here, it's giving me a nitrogen recommendation because nitrogen's not in your soil test. I forgot to mention that. That's a calculated value, but it didn't give me any other recommendations. It gave me a line recommendation. Maybe my soil test is in there, I'm not really sure. I don't remember if I added it, okay? But once you get your soil test information in there, you put your crop information in, now it should auto-generate recommendations for you. And then it'll also tell you what your crop removal will be. Remember, we talked about that last week. Okay. And this is in pounds per ton. So that's not total for the year. It's just how many pounds per ton. I think that's it. Did I miss anything? If you want to know what realistic yields are, you could use your soil fact sheets, but I don't know if people have those in your binders. Yeah, okay. So Sarah's here. She can answer all those questions. She's got a good handle on yields if you don't have any clue. Which, you know, so it happens. Yep. So if you can get your rotations in and your crops and you've done everything else, Okay, you got your soil test information in there. You'll be ready for what's to come.
Heather,
Yes,
well, I have an echo, I think.
not here.
Well, it's just here. It's very distracting. Anyway, we had a comment here just that you might have multiple crops and rotations, but when you're filling out Go Crop, the crops tab, you only put in the crop that you have in your field that year.
Right, yeah. So you're just planning for this coming season. So you're not gonna add every crop that you plan to grow in that field over that rotation. It's just this coming year's crop. There are cases where we have people harvesting 2 crops. So somebody might harvest, let's say, winter rye as forage, and then they're gonna also plant corn and harvest that. That would be a situation where you would actually add in another crop for that field, okay? If you are one of those folks, somebody in your classroom can help you kind of figure that out. All right, good luck. Ta-da!